Let me try to think of the big picture here in terms of the institutional framework. I want to show one or two slides. Yeah. So I just want to establish one or two parameters. We know some of the international statistics. The well-known Ease of Doing Business Index highlights some of the institutional problems that Greece has. It currently ranks 67th in the world, below Albania and Azerbaijan. Now, the good news is that in 2008, Greece had ranked 152nd in the world. We clearly see some improvements in terms of starting a business, now 37th, but once the business is established, then there are major problems sustaining entrepreneurial activity. For the business environment, Greece ranks 90th in getting finance and credit, 131st in enforcing contracts, 145th in registering a property. We know there are other difficulties as well. In terms of going through the courts, it takes almost 4.5 years in Greece on average for contracts to be enforced through the courts. That's almost twice the European Union average. These things are well known. We know something about the regulatory framework and the problems of entrepreneurship, and we're going to hear more about that in a moment. The other dimension here is that we also know about the problems of public administration in Greece. The average Greek distrusts state administration to be performing properly, expects the administration to be dysfunctional. It creates a sense of state institutions underperforming. Let me show you a graph in terms of attitudes towards public administration in the state. Good. We can look at attitudes in terms of public trust towards governments, favoritism, that is the sense that favoritism is shown in the award of jobs and contracts, and a sense that corruption is being controlled. We don't need to look in full detail at the graph. I simply want to emphasize that amongst the EU countries, Greece is at the wrong end of the spectrum there. But I also want to emphasize that Greece is not unique. It's at the end of the spectrum, surrounded by other EU member states as well. So in political science, we often think in terms of quality of institutions, and we define that in terms of levels of public trust, the perception of favoritism or corruption in the way the state operates. Let me now try to put some of these things together. We can look more generally at the performance. So look at how Greece absorbs EU structural funds. Again, this is the gap between the expected and the actual funds. So to the left-hand side, you have a bigger gap of underperformance, as it were. So Greece is at the end of the spectrum. Rules on public contracts. Here, Greece is at the far end of the spectrum. Rules on public contracts not being respected. Product market regulation, the barriers being maintained. Greece at the wrong end of the spectrum here. And the collection of taxes, value-added tax, again, the gap between the expected and the actual collection. Now, if we put these things together, what we have is a syndrome in which the public doesn't expect state institutions, public administration to be operating efficiently. It feeds on itself, therefore, in terms of a kind of trap of low expectations. The government machine will not deliver. And then if we relate that to actual performance, if we look at how Greek public administration performs in terms of tax revenue, absorption of public funds, the respect of public contracts, actually we have a very strong correlation here between the lack of trust, the sense of corruption, the sense of favoritism, and the underperformance of state institutions. So we have a connection. We've got a connection, a syndrome in which state institutions fail to deliver, a syndrome in which the public expects state institutions to fail to deliver, and a syndrome which is marked by government institutions lacking that distance from society, problems of trust, corruption, and favoritism. Now let me make one or two final points, if I may. Sorry. What does it add up to? What I want to say here is this: with this pattern of performance, with this kind of syndrome of state institutions and underperformance, can we be confident that without some kind of external constraint, without some kind of European or international intervention and support, could we be confident that the reform path in Greece would actually continue over successive governments? In other words, this is a syndrome which historically, under successive governments, has failed to perform on basic tasks of EU membership. Take away the external constraints, take away the bailouts, take away the pneumonia. How confident would we be that reform, structural reform in Greece would continue in the future? If there is a doubt in your mind, then let's also think in terms of the support that reform needs. I guess, and this is my final comment, I guess if there is a reform momentum in Greece in favor of structural reform and a more competitive environment, then again, I guess that momentum would depend very much on the kind of people in this room today and the kind of people at this conference. But it does beg questions. Final points. I'm not suggesting that Greece does not have potential. I'm not suggesting that the bailouts have been wonderfully crafted in terms of their conditionality. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that without some kind of external stimulus, I'm not confident that reform to a more liberal, competitive, open economy would survive changes of governments. Does Greece have potential? Yes. In quite a number of areas, there are comparative advantage, but then that's the test, isn't it? It's the test with this kind of potential, with that kind of comparative advantage, will the next government be able to support and sustain the kind of enterprise and innovation the Greek economy needs? Open question. Thank you.